Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Psychologist Against Anti-Semitism speaker series and tonight's webinar on a very timely and important topic, responding to anti-Semitism on university campuses, strategies for coping. My name is Dr. Julie Ansis. I'm the founder and the president of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism, otherwise known as PASS. PASS was founded in the summer of 2021. The mission of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism is to, 1, address and combat anti-Semitism within the field of psychology and related fields, 2, foster training and education that increases sensitivity and responsiveness to anti-Semitism and its effects on individuals, families, and communities, and 3, foster Jewish affirming research, education, clinical practice, and organizations. We are composed of approximately 800 psychologists and other mental health professionals, including faculty, clinicians, administrators, and students. If you wish to learn more and join us, I'll put the website address in the chat. Just complete the form in the link at the bottom of the homepage, and you'll be added to our email list. We also have a number of social media channels where we're very active. We have a Twitter or X page at PsychAAS, an Instagram account, a Facebook page, and a YouTube channel. All of this information is on our website. Now for today's event, Jewish students are experiencing a wave of anti-Semitism. Estimates from the ADL and other sources indicate that approximately 75% of Jewish college students surveyed have experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitism since the beginning of the 2023-2024 school year alone. Since October 7th, the percentage of Jewish students who said they feel comfortable with others on campus knowing they are Jewish has dropped significantly. Students often don't report their experiences because they don't know what to do and or fear backlash. We thought it was very important to hold a webinar now focused on this topic. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Corinne Dachi, who is the Vice President of Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism. Corinne will introduce the seminar as well as the speakers.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight and participating in this conversation with Dr. Caroline Kaufman and Dr. Thomas Plante. We're so grateful for them to volunteer to come share with us some information about how we can create supportive and safe spaces for Jewish students on campuses, and also what we can do, or what students can do, and what families can do in order to address some of the anti-Semitic incidents that they're exposed to on campuses. I want to introduce the speakers, and then we'll give them each about 10 minutes to speak about the topic, tonight's topic. And then what we'll do is we'll begin to ask them questions. What I would like to do is maybe to facilitate the conversations and to avoid interruptions. Maybe if you have questions you would like to ask our speakers, is drop them in the chat box, and I'll monitor the chat box and I'll ask the questions for you. And I think that will help keep the flow of the conversation going. And if really one of you would like to make comments at the end, maybe we can have 10 minutes at the end to make comments in specific that you would like to make, you may not have a question, but you would rather say something. So I will now introduce our speakers. Dr. Caroline Kaufman is an assistant psychologist at McLean Hospital and instructor at Harvard Medical School in the spirituality and mental health program. She completed her doctorate in child and family clinical psychology at the University of Memphis, her predoctoral internship in adolescent psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine, Yale-New Haven Hospital, and her postdoctoral fellowship at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. Her program of research focuses on the intersection of adversity, mental health, and spirituality, religion. She has specific publications discussing the psychology of anti-Semitism and provides workshops regularly and lectures on anti-Semitism to lay and academic audiences across the United States. Dr. Thomas Plante is the Augustin, I don't know how to actually say this, Augustin Cardinal B. S.J. University professor of psychology and religious studies, and he directs the Applied Spirituality Institute at Santa Clara University. He is an emeritus adjunct professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Stanford University, and he has published 29 books, including most recently Living Ethically in an Unethical World in 2024, and Living Better with Spiritually Based Strategies That Work, also in 2024. He's not busy enough, so he has to maintain a private practice as a licensed psychologist in Menlo Park, California. Very impressive speakers for tonight. And I would like to maybe open the floor, and perhaps we can start with Caroline, and to talk more about anti-Semitism and the impact of anti-Semitism and how to create Jewish affirming spaces for our students. Then we'll turn to Thomas to speak more about the administrative, what are ways that we can take actions to combat anti-Semitism on campus more formally. Caroline?
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'll go ahead and share my slides. Now, are y'all seeing the presenter view or the real view? Oh, we're good.
seeing
Okay,
the
great.
real view.
Real view.
Perfect. So thank you so much, excuse me, for coming to this talk, Responding to Anti-Semitism on University Campuses. I'm Dr. Caroline Kaufman. I'd like to offer a brief content warning. This presentation will discuss anti-Semitism and associated forms of discrimination and oppression. And also a disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent the views and/or positions of McLean Hospital, Massachusetts General Brigham, Harvard University, or Harvard Medical School. I'd also like to offer a perspective. I identify as an anti-Semitism researcher, and when thinking about anti-Semitism, I like to think about two quotes when engaging in it, particularly in conversations. And the first quote is from Deborah Lipstadt. She's a Holocaust historian, internationally recognized. And she says, "It is hard, if not impossible, to explain something that is essentially irrational, delusional, and absurd." Many times when I'm giving talks like these, I'm explaining the psychology of anti-Semitism, which I find impossible because, again, it's irrational, delusional, and absurd. And I think that's an important thing to remember when talking about anti-Semitism. It doesn't make sense because it isn't true. The second quote is from Taylor Swift. And she has a song. She says, "I could build a castle out of all the bricks they threw at me. Every day is like a battle, but every night with us is like a dream." And I think it's important as a Jew, when talking to both Jews and non-Jews about anti-Semitism, that we recognize the bricks that are being thrown at the Jewish community. But we also recognize the castles and the dreams and the joy. And it is possible to hold both of those things. And because tonight we're also talking about resilience, I want us also to remember the dreams and the joy. I also have personal experiences with anti-Semitism. In 2018, my family's graves were desecrated in an anti-Semitic incident in Fall River, Massachusetts. The FBI investigated. It's still an open investigation with, I think, almost no likelihood of finding out who perpetrated this act. I also have personal experiences with anti-Semitism, both in graduate school and undergraduate, that I won't talk about in a recorded webinar, but I'm happy to talk about at another time. And I give you this background not to sort of legitimize my point or make you think it's worth listening to me, but to just show you that anti-Semitism for me is personal. And because it is personal, it is interesting, it is passionate, and it is important to me. And that's how I approach this work as someone who's really experienced it in several ways. I'd like to provide us with a brief definition of anti-Semitism. There are several definitions being used both in the research literature and among lay people, particularly politicians. A popular definition comes from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA. You'll probably see that online and even in research publications. I prefer a slightly different definition, and the definition is that anti-Semitism is hostile beliefs toward Jews as a collective, manifested in individuals as attitudes, in culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and imagery, and in actions, social or legal discrimination, political mobilization against Jews, and collective or state violence, which results in and/or is designed to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. The reason I like this definition is because it represents or it recognizes that anti-Semitism can occur as attitudes, as cognitions, and also as behaviors. And if you're a therapist or clinician, you'll sort of represent this triangle here, or remember this triangle here. I also like this definition because it recognizes that anti-Semitism can occur on multiple levels. The individual level, or the micro level, the group level, the meso level, you might call it, and the macro level, so culturally or institutionally. And this is taken from Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. And that's what I like about this definition. So anti-Semitism on campus, this has already been described to us today. I'll just briefly review it here. I think if you're here tonight, you believe that anti-Semitism is an issue and that it's occurring on campuses. And as referenced earlier with research from the ADL, college students and Jewish college students on campuses are telling us it's a problem right now. Indeed, 32% of Jewish college students feel unable to speak out about anti-Semitism, both at their university and otherwise. 73% of Jewish college students witness or experience anti-Semitism. 46% of Jewish college students feel physically safe on campus, meaning 54% don't feel safe on their campus. 33% of Jewish college students feel emotionally safe on campus, meaning about 2/3 don't. 39% of Jewish college students feel comfortable disclosing their Jewish identity, meaning the majority don't feel comfortable disclosing their identity. And 67% of Jewish college students feel universities are not doing enough to address anti-Semitism. And finally, as referenced earlier, 55% or over half of Jewish college students report doing nothing following an anti-Semitic incident. And I share that because it's concerning, and it's concerning for a number of reasons. We don't know exactly why. There's some fear of retribution. There also may be some lack of information about resources, but there may also be more at play there, and I think it's worth recognizing. There are several consequences of experienced prejudice and discrimination. Unfortunately, there's a gap in the research literature about the experience of anti-Semitism among Jews, and particularly among Jewish college students. But what we know from research with other marginalized communities is that among other groups, those who experience prejudice and discrimination are at risk of mental health concerns, particularly depressive symptoms. And that the experience of prejudice and discrimination accumulates over time, meaning it gets heavier and heavier, and the impact on mental health outcomes can get worse and worse over time. Among college students with marginalized identities, experiences of prejudice and discrimination are associated with anger, anxiety, depressive symptoms, and loneliness. Among Jews in particular, but not necessarily Jewish college students, because again, there's a gap in the research literature. And if you want to talk about the need for funding, I'm happy to have that conversation with you. But among Jews who experience anti-Semitism, outcomes include anxiety, depressive symptoms, feelings of marginalization, higher stress, lower life satisfaction, and also internalized anti-Semitism. So when I speak to both lay audiences and academic audiences who may be Jewish or not Jewish, often I'm asked, well, how can we reduce the risk of anti-Semitism? We do know that certain Jews have a higher risk of experiencing anti-Semitic harassment or discrimination. And those include undergraduate or Jews in undergraduate and graduate education settings. And this, by the way, is research from before October 7th. This was true, that Jews in these contexts are at higher risk of experiencing anti-Semitic harassment or discrimination. Also, Jews who are more religious or have a stronger religious background are at higher risk. That may or may not be because they wear certain symbols that identify them as Jews. Maybe they speak about their experience, they are identifiable, or spending more time in Jewish institutions, engaging in Jewish cultural practices. It's not clear. Also, Jews who have a greater connection to the state of Israel have a higher risk of experiencing anti-Semitic harassment or discrimination. And there's an overall increased risk of anti-Semitic incidents following key anti-Semitic events. And again, this is research from before October 7th, but there is research to suggest that when there's one large anti-Semitic incident that perhaps gets news coverage, that there's higher risk of different events or smaller events across the country. And this is all with American Jews, by the way. Now, if you look at this, either as a Jew, as a parent of a Jew, as an educator or administrator, personally, I don't feel good, because what are we going to say to our Jewish students or our Jewish colleagues or friends? Well, don't go to college or higher education, because there may be a risk of anti-Semitism there. Hide your religious background or reduce your religious ties. Hide, denounce, or reduce your ties to Israel. And when there's an anti-Semitic incident, be on guard. I don't really quite know what that means. I don't think it leaves us in a good place. And particularly when talking about reducing risk of anti-Semitism, I sometimes hear, well, how can we reduce our likelihood? What can we do? And there are certain thoughts or behaviors that are suggested. And those who have experienced anti-Semitism or have a fear of experiencing anti-Semitism, which, as we've discussed, may be legitimate among university students, there are sometimes efforts to conceal one's identity. And when we talk about concealment of Jewish identity, we mean removal of religious or cultural symbols or items, avoidance of Jewish institutions and places, avoidance of Jewish events, and then we also see an overall social withdrawal and isolation. And by the way, this is research specifically among Jews who've experienced anti-Semitism or have a fear of anti-Semitism, this concealment behavior. There are major problems with concealment behavior. One of them also being that there are poor mental health outcomes associated with concealment behavior, meaning among Jews, concealment is associated with depressive symptoms, internalized anti-Semitism, self-hate, guilt, and an overall feeling of lack of safety, meaning the perception of lack of safety actually increases when people conceal their Jewish identity. I think also most concerning is that there's no evidence that concealment works, meaning there's no evidence that if you conceal your Jewish identity, you will gain access to physical or emotional safety on college campuses or otherwise. So to me, if we know that concealment doesn't really work, and in fact, concealment might increase our risk of poor outcomes, I think there's a need to focus on resilience among Jews and also changing certain policies and cultures to decrease anti-Semitism and increase affirming Jewish spaces. So if we think of anti-Semitism as rain, and we think of protective strategies and mechanisms maybe as our umbrella, remember I was trained as a child psychologist, so of course we were going to get a cartoon in here. There's actually research to suggest that there's a lower risk of experienced anti-Semitism associated with having a greater number of Jewish friends. Of course, this doesn't unilaterally protect against anti-Semitism, but we do see people reporting statistically less anti-Semitism among those who have a larger number of Jewish friends. I think from a college or university perspective, this means the importance of providing opportunities for connection among Jewish students, Jewish faculty, Jewish staff, and perhaps putting those different groups all together to create opportunities for friendship. Additionally, among Jews who experience anti-Semitism, we see better outcomes among those with higher religious observance and involvement, meaning we need to provide opportunities for Jewish students, Jewish faculty, and Jewish staff to engage with their religion, to be observant, and to be involved. And I put involvement there because sometimes I hear, well, I can't tell my Jewish students that they have to read Torah or anything like that. No, but perhaps Jewish students could go to the Jewish Cultural Center, could go to Hillel, could go to Chabad, just to go to these spaces and see what it's like to be involved without necessarily having to engage in religious practices. Also, social support is associated with better outcomes in the context of anti-Semitism, things like acceptance and validation. And by the way, this social support does not have to come from just Jewish friends, relatives, and otherwise. This social support can come from Jews and non-Jews. Also, better outcomes are associated with exposure to representation, meaning seeing Jews in TV, movies, music, media, perhaps seeing Jewish representation in our courses about multicultural identity, multiculturalism, and seeing Jewish identity being included in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which we know from research statistically, Jews are often in Jewish identity are not included in these initiatives and educational settings. Religious coping is associated with better outcomes in the context of anti-Semitism. Also, we see this is true particularly among Orthodox Jews, having greater trust in God. So again, sort of this religious observance potentially. Now, interestingly, meaning making is associated with increased resilience among Jews in the context of anti-Semitism. And I put a highlight around that because there's evidence to suggest that meaning making, meaning making sense, ascribing some meaning both to the experience of adversity, in this case, anti-Semitism, and coping in context of that adversity is associated with better outcomes. And this is true for Israeli Jews and American Jews, but is not necessarily true for all their counterparts who experience other forms of discrimination and prejudice, that there may be something unique about being Jewish, making meaning of anti-Semitism, coping with anti-Semitism, and that might actually be associated with better outcomes. We know in the context of other forms of discrimination, because again, Jewish functioning, particularly in the context of anti-Semitism, is underfunded. Among other groups, humor is associated with better outcomes in the context of prejudice and discrimination. Low substance use, which is very, very important for our university students who may be using substances or experimenting with substances, very important. And also low self-blame. Meaning, I once worked with a family whose son pretty recently experienced a physical incident of anti-Semitism. And the mom, in a moment of panic, said to me, well, he shouldn't have been wearing that, referencing his kippah. He shouldn't have been wearing that on campus. That's why it happened. And said that to the child, who then blamed themselves for having worn that, for having potentially brought this upon himself. We know from the research that low self-blame, or that self-blame does not help. As we talked about before, it may not decrease your risk of experiencing anti-Semitism. And also it's probably associated with worse mental health outcomes in the context of experienced anti-Semitism. It's not helpful. So there are times when, despite our umbrellas, no matter how good they are, the rain gets through. Distress, fear, hopelessness, and despair occur. And I will tell you, as someone who does these workshops and talks fairly regularly, I write and read about anti-Semitism quite a bit. There are days that the raindrops get through. And what to do on those days? Research suggests seeking out affirming mental health professionals is vital. I underline affirming, and you'll see a citation in the bottom right corner of your screen, because there's quite a bit of research to suggest that those in the counseling, social work, and psychological communities do not have competence in affirming care for Jews experiencing anti-Semitism. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're actively unaffirming or aggressive, but it just might not mean that their education led them to understand or work effectively with Jewish identity and experiences of anti-Semitism among their patients. This also doesn't mean that if you are referred to or send someone to a Jewish mental health professional, they'll be competent in this issue. In fact, we as Jewish mental health professionals, I didn't learn about it in school either. I had to learn about it on my own. So seeking out these specific affirming mental health professionals is very important, which might mean giving additional training to university counselors and support staff, because they likely did not get it in school. Also providing access to, I see that I'm very much over time, Tom, I'm going to talk really quick here. Providing access to affirming spaces, Hillel, JCCs, informal groups, temple, synagogue. At your university, there may not be all of these affirming spaces on campus. I can tell you my undergrad was so small, we didn't have a Hillel. We had a Jewish center, but our school provided free transportation to synagogues in the area, to JCCs in the area. And that was something that was provided to us to get off campus, to find an affirming space, to make friends, and to seek social support. And I also want to highlight that affirming spaces are not necessarily safe spaces. Jewish university students probably cannot find one single space where everyone agrees with them on what it means to be Jewish, on how to live Jewishly, on Israel, on the best Jewish dessert. There may be disagreement in those spaces. What's important is that there are spaces where we can disagree and express ourselves in a physically and emotionally safe way, but not necessarily a safe space. It's also very important, particularly when experiencing anti-Semitism, to seek out positive portrayals of Jewish life, culture, and experience. I don't think Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld can fix everything in life, but I can tell you on a bad day when I've received an anti-Semitic email, I'll sometimes watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, and it does help a little bit. But also seeking out podcasts, movies, books with positive portrayals of Jewish life, beyond the Holocaust, beyond what's difficult about being Jewish, is very, very important. And in fact, for those of you working with university students, there are Instagrams and TikToks devoted to positive Jewish identity. And when we see our students engaging in TikTok and Instagram and only looking at anti-Semitism and only looking at coverage of physical anti-Semitic incidents, it's not good. But there are opportunities for positive portrayals of Jewish life on social media. Also, there may be a time and a place, you might be in one, when you need to create such spaces because they don't exist. And these can be formal and informal networks and spaces. I can tell you there are multiple people on this call who have been a part of creating those spaces for me. I didn't create them among pediatric psychologists and now PASS, which is wonderful. And these can be virtual and in person. These virtual opportunities might be particularly important for our university students, staff, and faculty who are in small communities, who feel that they are in isolated communities, to find that community otherwise. I'll just end with this brief quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He said, "This is how to deal with crisis. Wrestle with it, refusing to let it go until it blesses you, until you emerge stronger, better, or wiser than you were before. To be a Jew is not to accept defeat, and that is the meaning of faith." And I think this is an important quote when talking about anti-Semitism and all forms of isms that might be affecting our university students, our faculty, our staff. We cannot accept defeat. We must keep working towards creating inclusive, just spaces for everyone. So with that, Tom, I'm so terribly sorry. I talk forever. I'm turning it over to you. If I can turn this off. There we go.
Thank you, Caroline. You provided such pragmatic recommendations also that are very useful. And I think Tom now is going to tell us what we can do administratively to address anti-Semitism on campuses.
Well, thank you, everyone. And Carolyn, please don't apologize. It was a fabulous presentation. The slides were terrific, and I think it was so helpful. And I'm grateful for the time you've spent putting in that presentation, and I'm sure it'll help a lot of people. So thank you for that. I also want to thank Corinne for inviting me here with you, and also for Julie as well for all the terrific work she's doing with the group. In the spirit of full disclosure, I should mention that I personally am not Jewish myself. I happen to be Roman Catholic, although my wife, together for 42 years, Lori, she's a psychologist and she's Jewish. My son is Jewish. And so I belong to a Reformed temple, and I also belong to a Catholic community. In fact, my son's first line of his college admission essay when he went off to college was, "Not many people can say that there were more Jesuit priests at his bar mitzvah than rabbis," and which was true. So I am in an interfaith home and also a dear friend to the Jewish community, but I am not myself Jewish. I just really wanted to bring up three critical points about managing these horrific issues on a college campus. And I speak to, as someone who's been a college professor at Santa Clara University for 30 years, and in psychiatry at Stanford University Med School for 35 years, and a former, department chair and dean of one of our schools here at Santa Clara. And so the first point I don't have slides. I hope that's okay. I'm just going to try to make 3 points. Carolyn did a fabulous job. How could I follow Carolyn with the slides? So the first point I want to make is that Title VI It's very important for anyone on a college campus who is worried about anti-Semitism to be mindful of Title VI. And Title VI comes from the civil rights law of 1964. You may be familiar with Title IX. Title IX gets a lot of press on college campuses because it speaks to having a situation where we have equality among athletics, gender and athletics. And so you may be quite familiar with Title IX. You hear about Title IX. There's Title IX officers on every college campus, because you may realize that, for example, if a university is spending a lot of time and money on, let's say, men's football or men's basketball, that's potentially discriminatory among women athletes who may not have as many resources on a college campus as some of these high-profile sports and expensive sports. So we are all probably familiar with Title IX, which speaks to this kind of gender equality on a college campus. But there is also what's called Title VI. And Title VI speaks to no discrimination based on ethnicity and race and country of origin and so forth. And this becomes particularly important in terms of anti-Semitism, because as you know, that Judaism is so much more and so much richer than just a religious tradition. It also speaks to an ethnicity. It also speaks to a country of origin and so forth. And so Title VI basically tells us that anti-Semitism is illegal on any college campus. It's not just bad. It's not, of course, it's bad. It's not just bad. It's not just ignorant and all of those things. It's also illegal. So the law is on your side, you could say, if you are experiencing or you're concerned about anti-Semitism on a college campus. Now, of course, I'm not a lawyer myself. I've talked with lawyers, higher education lawyers, about this very issue, but I'm not a lawyer myself in terms of full disclosure. And so, but there are lawyers on campus that can help students navigate this issue from a Title VI perspective. So that's my first point. The second point is that to be sure that you're mindful of the difference between the academic versus the non-academic resources on a college campus. So, for example, if the anti-Semitic act occurs in the classroom, a professor or a fellow student says something, does something that is anti-Semitic, the pathway to deal with that is different than if the anti-Semitic act occurred, let's say, in the cafeteria or it happened on the sports field or something like that. And so it's important to kind of have a sense of university life of these kind of two parallel structures of academic versus non-academic university life. So, for example, if something happens in the classroom, what should we do? Well, probably the first order of business is to talk to the instructor of the class and say, hey, look, this happened either with a fellow student or you said something that was anti-Semitic or something like that. And hopefully resolution can occur. Now, sometimes, as we probably all know, when people act in ways that are discriminatory or harassing or something like that, sometimes they very much do it on purpose. There's no question that they're doing it on purpose. And if they're confronted with this, they get very defensive, perhaps blaming the victim or something like that. And then sometimes it's more like somebody steps on somebody's toes and they're mortified or horrified that what they said or did was perceived as being discriminatory. They didn't know, they were ignorant, they messed up, and they appreciate the corrective feedback and they accept the corrective feedback and they do something to make sure it doesn't happen again. So it's kind of important to know a little bit, at least, about what was the spirit of this act. But anyway, so the issue then is, if it happens in a classroom, for example, or let's say a professor's office or something that's academically oriented, there's a pathway of dealing with it that might include first talking to the instructor, hopefully getting resolution. If that doesn't happen, then moving up the chain, going to the department chair, trying to get resolution there. If that doesn't happen, then probably going to the dean's office. Every school, whether it's engineering, business, arts and science, or what have you, has its own dean's office in most universities, and one might then go to the dean's office. If it doesn't get resolution there, then you start to head to the provost's office and so forth. So the academic side would be instructor to department chair to dean to provost. Now, if it happens in the non-academic side, let's say something was said at the cafeteria or in a dorm room, or maybe an athletic field, then the pathway is a bit different. Rather than going in this academic route that I mentioned, the pathway is more to the dean of students. There's some kind of a student affairs, dean of students, something in that realm, which will probably be the first step, and then move from there, from the dean of students, then probably to the provost's office or the academic vice president's office, or then on from there. So the first point I want to make, of course, is about that Title VI speaks to the law is on your side, and that's just good to know. Second is that if the incident occurs in the academic arena, you follow one pathway. If it occurs in the non-academic arena of student life, you follow a different pathway. And then the third is trying to get that sense of the violation. Is this something that someone says out of ignorance, that they'd be mortified if they were provided that corrective feedback and they try to fix it, make things right, or is it beyond that? And that can be helpful too. And then finally, what I might say is that how, Carolyn did a terrific job talking about a variety of coping strategies, including social support. And of course, that's so important to have that social support, whether it's fellow students, whether it's faculty and staff who are sympathetic and want to help you and maybe mentor you through some of these issues. And all of that social support is super, super helpful. Perhaps Hillel on campus or Chabad on campus or something like that, or Office of Student Life. Or Office of Religious Life on a college campus, or chaplaincy service, or what have you, that might be available. Campus ministry, something like that, can be very, very helpful. So you want that support, but you also want to know what your legal options are too, and the university legal counsel office, whether you can start off with the Title IX officer and take it from there, but if you're looking for separate legal help, higher education law. There are law firms that specialize in this. One of my dearest friends from college is involved with these kinds of lawsuits. She's a higher education attorney in Boston, and she is involved with some of these things. So those are the kind of the 3 points I want to make. Title VI, academic versus non-academic. And what's the level of the violation? Is this something that corrective feedback can fix, or is this something that no, we need to really go hard here and push hard here? At the end of the day, as you know, as Carolyn very well articulated at the beginning of her presentation, that it makes no sense. Anti-Semitism makes absolutely no sense. And yet we are and right when we feel like we've made terrific progress or something, or things are better, all of a sudden they're really not. And certainly October 7th unleashed something in people that is mortifying, horrifying, and discouraging beyond words. And yet we need to be thoughtful about all the resources that are available to us to push back and push back hard, so that we can do everything we possibly can to help people that might be experiencing the stress and strain of anti-Semitism. So with that, I will stop there, because I know there is probably plenty of folk who might want to make comments or have questions or whatever. And again, I want to thank Carolyn for her presentation, Corinne for her invitation, and for Julie's leadership for this wonderful Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism group, who I have told everybody who will listen to join. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Michelle asked a question in the chat, and Caroline had a chance to respond to it. Her suggestion, and I'll read the question to you. How can college students and their parents demonstrate that they have been subjected to anti-Semitism when college administrators do not endorse that these incidents are actually anti-Semitic or bad enough? For example, when students scream from the river to the sea, or globalize the Intifada, or more subtly, wear keffiyehs to a specific Jewish space in order to intimidate or threaten them, threaten others. This is clearly anti-Semitic, but as we have seen in certain hearings, administrators, even presidents of universities, are not recognizing those statements are as anti-Semitic or threatening in nature. Caroline suggested kind of stepping out of the university and using resources out of campus to hold those administrators accountable. But I'm wondering what you might add to this.
Well, that's a fabulous question. I'm so glad you asked because, of course, it's getting so much press because of, the high profile situation, at Harvard and MIT and UPenn and elsewhere. And I think there's, as a university administrator, or have been a university administrator myself and living in university life for, 3.5 decades, I think there's three things to keep in mind that university administrators are afraid of. And you want to know about that. One is money, donors or losing money. That's huge. Two is bad press. And three is the law. So those three things are so important to remember. And when university administrators are not sympathetic, let's say, to anti-Semitism, or they don't treat it seriously, then I think those three things need to come to play in mind, because one of the things that sunk, the president of Penn and the president of Harvard is that you have situations where money is threatened. Big donors say no more, no more. And that's very, very important because big money matters in university life. So that's one. The second is they don't like bad press, and going to the press about some of these issues could be an option. Now, of course, whenever you whip things up, you have to be ready to have the pushback. So there is that. And the three is the law. And so consulting with a higher education attorney could be, or civil rights attorney could be a helpful move to see exactly what your options are. So I think I've always been a believer, perhaps because of my own upbringing, is that you get more with honey than with vinegar. So in other words, that you try to help people to see your point of view. Esther and I served on the civility task force for the American Psychological Association. Who knew we would have gotten pushback on civility, but yes, we did. And so I'm always for trying to find a helpful civil strategy to problem solve. But if that just can't happen, you want to know where the power kind of lies, and it really does in money, press, and the law. I'll stop there. Thank you. Great question.
As a Jewish graduate student, I made several complaints to my university, which received public funding, private funding, and it wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't viewed as anti-Semitism, despite meeting the definition that I gave you. And I will say that there was also retribution from faculty members involved for that comment. So to your question, sometimes there are not good opportunities and support available. And people must decide and must, I think, be cognizant of the consequences of reporting anti-Semitism and engaging in topics about anti-Semitism, particularly those who are vulnerable, meaning without tenure, students, staff, and otherwise. As a PhD student who desperately just wanted to get her degree and get out of there, I will tell you that eventually I dropped my complaint because I did not have the money, resources, or time for a legal defense. So I'm trying not to answer your question in a way that's very depressing, But my response is there may not be an immediate support. And that is why I think that it is important for faculty, staff, and students to have opportunities for support and community, sometimes off campus, if your campus, for whatever reason, doesn't provide those to you. And I'm sorry, because that's not the answer I wish I could give you.
I'm wondering, Caroline, in your particular situation, if it might have been, if you had had allies on campus, for example, faculty who you knew were supportive of you, or maybe not. I see your facial expression, but I'm wondering, and Thomas, you might say something. Would those allies on campus be able to shine the light on the problem in a way that maybe was not legal, but to put pressure? Because of what I'm hearing you say, Thomas, is it's important to shine the light on it and to put pressure on those who are perpetrating anti-Semitic act on campus. And sometimes we have to do it on behalf of the students who feel powerless in those situations. And yes, there's a lot at stake for them.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And we have to, shine a light on it. And we do need allies, not just in the Jewish community, but outside of the Jewish community. Sometimes it's very helpful, I think, for me as a Roman Catholic to say, whoa, 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 no, this is not acceptable, and make it crystal clear that anti-Semitism is not acceptable. So I think we have to pull whatever resources we can. Whether they are within the Jewish community, outside of the Jewish community, to try to rally in support. University of the Stanford campus, ever since October 7th, there is a massive sort of structure in White Plaza, the main part of in between like the student union and the bookstore and so forth, where kind of pro-Palestinian students have put up this massive structure with all sorts of signs and so forth. And everybody on campus has to walk by that structure, and it's really kind of very disturbing to read some of those signs. And it's been up since basically a day or two or whatever, since October 7th. I think this needs to be a lot more rallying of allies all over to try to help push back and push back hard. And I totally agree. Sometimes, as Carolyn said, that you don't have the money, you don't have the time, you've got other things you got to be dealing with and whatnot. And so that's where maybe some others can help to do the lifting, to help push you forward. I'll stop.
There's another question in the chat regarding President Trump's executive order on combating anti-Semitism and the impact it may have had on university and college campuses. I think it says it was issued on December 11th, 2019. Are you aware of what impact it may have had?
We've only seen a rise in anti-Semitism since 2016, including during Trump's presidency and following when this was released in 2019. So I can't say unilaterally. I'm not seeing in the research how it's made a significant impact, to be honest. And the former president has made comments that I would perceive to be anti-Semitic, certainly about why he chooses certain lawyers because of their religious observance. I'll end my comments there.
So I would like, since we're talking about universities, there is a question that was asked regarding curricula, and I think you touched upon this issue, Caroline. And the question was, how can universities enhance their curricula to include content that promotes understanding and appreciation of diverse cultures, including Judaism? What would you suggest?
So I think it's go ahead, Tom.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, first off, depending on what kind of university you're at, like at Santa Clara University, it's a Catholic Jesuit university. Every student, regardless of academic major, has to have a full year of religious studies. And that full year of religious studies does not have to be, Catholicism or anything like that. It could be Judaism. It could be Buddhism. It could be a variety of different things, but they have to have a full year. In addition to that, every student, regardless of academic major, has to have a full year of sort of kind of ethnic studies, you could say. That could be women and gender studies or something like that. So the private schools, particularly the religiously affiliated private schools, may have mechanisms in their curriculum that can support these efforts. Public universities are a little harder. They tend to be more skittish about religious studies as part of the academic curriculum, whether it's in Judaism or other topic areas. And so I think one of the things we have to kind of look at is, what kind of university are you going to? Is it public? Is it private? Is it faith-based? Is it not faith-based? And depending on the type of school we're looking at, may determine how you might respond in terms of the curriculum. I think Santa Clara does a very good job on this front, but again, we can do things at a private, religiously affiliated school that you just cannot do at a public university. And I'll let Carolyn take it from there.
We see that in multicultural textbooks in psychology, counseling psychology, and social work do not include adequate coverage of Jewish identity. And there is room for better coverage of many different identities. And there is a clear gap that's been revealed in research in cultural competence and training in treating Jewish patients and working with Jewish patients in an affirming way. So I think it's worth thinking about any of us who teach multicultural competency, multicultural counseling, multicultural approaches, who are on DEI, JEDI, any of these works, in taking a clear and critical look at the different identities and groups that are being incorporated, because I think it's likely that Jews are being left out, and also that other groups are being left out too. So taking a moment to reassess, I think, is incredibly important. I'm just noticing. Oh, something's in the chat. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Yes. The question in the chat is, what about acts that are anti-Semitic in effect, speech and demos calling for extinguishing Israel, perpetrated by Jewish students?
Yes, and I can tell you, just from my personal experience, it's not necessarily revealed in research, but sometimes those statements can be the most painful and can feel the most harmful. And people can, someone can say something that's anti-Semitic that's Jewish, and someone can still have a harmful effect on other Jews, even if they are Jewish. And I still think that it's worth interrogating and discussing those comments, and potentially even reporting those comments, even if they come from someone with a Jewish identity. They can still have a negative impact, and I think they can still meet our definition of anti-Semitism as discussed previously.
Thank you. I don't know, Thomas, if you want to add to this.
Well, the thing is, some of you may have seen this report. I believe it was I got it out of the New York Times, that said that something like 70% of people who are chanting, from the river to the sea, don't even know what it means. And I think part of the problem that we have here is that, nowadays, people want to think in terms of bumper stickers. If you can't fit it on a bumper sticker or a tweet, then it's too complicated. And I think one of the problems we have in this regard is some students and so forth, they sort of have a very narrow view and a bumper sticker view of the problem, and want to quickly kind of put it into this kind of white oppressor, colonizing way of thinking of the world, and they don't really understand the nuance. And I think some universities have done this well, and some dealt with this well, and some have not. So, for example, an example of what was done, in my sense, well, I'll give the example of Dartmouth. And again, in full disclosure, my son went to Dartmouth. He graduated a half dozen years ago, or so, but so I do have a relationship with Dartmouth that way in terms of they took a lot of my money while he was there as a student. But what Dartmouth did when this issue emerged, as I understand it, is they very quickly took experts in the academic areas that were relevant to the conflict. And they quickly put together a symposium, as universities should do, and said, okay, what can we understand about this terrible problem? And have Middle East experts, religious studies experts, geopolitical experts, and so forth come together and talk about it in that way. And they seem to have avoided some of the problems that Columbia had and Harvard had and Stanford had and some other places. And so universities need to be universities. They need to be places of education, and they can't by themselves solve geopolitical conflicts and this and that, and they should kind of stay within their lane. And unfortunately, college students are young. You know, they're 18 to 22 as a rule of thumb. Sometimes they get swept up into stuff that they don't know what they're getting swept up into. And that's why we have to do what universities do best, is educate with the very best experts around to help guide them. And so again, if 70% of people chanting from the river to the sea have no clue what that means, you know, that tells you something.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Caroline. Esther, you raised your
Yes,
hand, so would you like to ask a
Yes.
question?
Thank you. I also want to make a comment, and I nodded when you mentioned Dartmouth because I want to make sure that people know that they are accessible and that there are terrific little videos of how you model collaboration, although you are faculty who say, we are learning with you rather than just telling you an answer or taking sides. And we are going to continue to work with them. They are accessible, so I'll leave it at that. But a couple of things that I think might be helpful to point out. One is that when Tom said the 3 factors that your universities are afraid of, there is also a kind of a convenient soft excuse by saying, well, if we side with X group, then obviously we are discriminating against Y and Z group. So we are basically doing very vague kind of things. But one of the things that I would recommend, particularly if you are in leadership position, is go to the strategic plan of the university and make sure that you make a link between what is happening and what they espouse to create as a culture of why people should come to them, why they should give them money, why they should have good press. So I think that this is a strategy that works. It takes a lot of Sisyphus work sometimes, but it works. This is number 1. Number 2 that I wanted to share with you in case you didn't get to it yet, or you're not members and you don't receive from APA Monitor on Psychology. The latest one that was it came out in January and February 2024 that has the 12 emerging trends for 24. One of them particularly on page 40 on is fighting misinformation. So the social media, you don't need to know from the river to the sea, because the social media is telling you again and again and again from the river to the sea. So kind of making links to that. And clinically, Caroline, you did a terrific job together with Tom. But I think that one aspect that has to do with resilience, and I'm saying it simply because he mentioned resilience, is the post-traumatic growth that Rich Tedeschi in his work, I lecture about it because I like the fact that it's a hopeful way of saying many things that are very structured and simple that might be important to consider when interacting with students. And last but not least, I think that we are all kind of doing parallel attempts to do things together for students. And when we have focus groups, one of the things that you'll know better than many others, that they are saying is, I just want to be heard. So it's not as if you have to have a magic wand and a big umbrella that covers all the raindrops that are still seeping in, but just to be accessible. And sometimes it's the organization from the outside that creates it before we can create dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Esther. And your comment will conclude our evening event. I want to thank everyone for attending and coming with questions, comments. And thank you, Thomas and Caroline, for sharing your knowledge and expertise about the topic and making recommendations, helping us understand what we can do differently. Again, and this webinar was recorded. We will post it on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to distribute it widely to those of us who were not able to attend tonight. Again, thank you, everyone.
And I did
Thank
put my
you.
email in the chat if people want to reach out for whatever reason.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for organizing, and Corinne for being such a gracious facilitator.
You're welcome.
Thank you.